It is my pleasure to introduce Victor Shinazi. And as we have already mentioned a couple of times, it is midnight for Victor. So thanks again for giving this talk to all of us in the rest of the world. And when I was looking into Victor's profile, I actually thought it might have been easier for me to discuss places where he hasn't been. But just to start, Victor trained in geography and urban planning at Concordia University in Montreal. He gained his PhD in geography from UCL in London. After this, he held a postdoc position at the University of Pennsylvania on the east coast of the US, and then on the west coast at the University of Oregon. More recently, Victor held a senior lecturer position at ETH Zurich, where he was also a PI for the Cognition, Perception and Behavior in Urban Environments project at the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore. And Victor is now an assistant professor of psychology at Bond University in Australia. Victor's work combines behavioral and neuroimaging techniques to investigate navigation behavior in built environments, using the data to inform architectural design and investigating the impact of the environment on health and well-being. And in addition to his many contributions to cognitive science, I was amazed to learn that Victor is fluent in 5 languages. So thank you all very much for joining us. I'm very much looking forward to this talk. And now I will hand over to you, Victor.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to move a window away from here so I can actually see my screen. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Klaus, for inviting me. It's really an honor to present in the colloquium. And I'm going to jump right into to my talk because I want to try to cover at least 3 experiments that we have conducted over the last couple of years. One of them has been published already, so it might be more familiar to people, but 2 of them are about to come out. So it's just a good opportunity to present and get some feedback too. So I'm going to be talking about 3 experiments that in some way or the other involve psychophysiology and spatial cognition. The 2 last ones have more of a navigation component, which is probably my favorite topic, but really they kind of all build on each other because they built on technologies that for many years we've been working in the lab. The second one, we'll talk about wayfinding and motivation, and I'm really careful to use the word motivation and not stress, and I'll be clear about that when we get to that experiment. And the last one, it's about emergency evacuation in virtual reality. So if I could just give a quick nod to 3 wildly unpopular papers. We managed to publish them in really low impact journals. And funny enough, I think that all of the work that has followed after that would not happen if it weren't for these 3 papers. So just actually, let me get my laser pointer here. So just as a quick recap on these papers, the first paper is a paper on a framework that we developed at ETH Zurich called EVE, Experiments in Virtual Environments, which is really the backbone of all these experiments that I'm going to be talking about that uses VR and psychophysiology, and is what really allowed us to properly record and analyze this data. The second paper, it's again a very boring paper, but it was essential as we were all learning how to use psychophysiology. The field is very noisy, and we wanted to make sure that we develop good practices and kind of stay consistent in what we measure through the different projects that we were conducting. And the last one is a project, one of the first projects we developed at the Chair of Cognitive Science at ETH, which was kind of provided us with a shocking result. What we found, the biggest message of that paper is that we found that basically the biggest predictor of your wayfinding ability was your ability to use a joystick. And we make an argument that this is true because we found that one specific task that required intercepting a specific moving object on screen was the one that predicted best performance in a later wayfinding task. It was actually virtual Silkton that we used as the wayfinding task. And we tied back this ability to intercept this fear to actually ability to manipulate this joystick. And this was a bit of an eye opener. It's not the result you want to get if you are in spatial cognition, but it kind of took us back to the drawing table. Whenever we're going to do VR, and whenever we do VR from now on, we were really, really careful to train our participants and really make sure that they can handle how to use a mouse and keyboard or a joystick. And I'll get to that a little bit more when I talk about these experiments. So also a quick nod to three people, three of my students, Yasha, Rafael, and Hantal, who are, I guess, joined the lab as computer scientists, and I'd really like to believe later on became somehow cognitive scientists. So I was able to convert them, but they were essentially instrumental in developing this technology, developing the virtual worlds that we were working with. And I mean, none of the projects that I'm going to be talking about would be a reality without them. And of course, my good friend and colleague, Tyler Thrash, who really is just my writing partner, my academic soulmate. So really big nods to all these people, or else none of this that I'm going to be showing would be a reality. Okay, so the first project I'll talk about is neighborhoods and health. And I'll just start by showing you some photographs from a project that's called Unequal Scenes by a photographer called Johnny Miller. And if you go to his website, he actually describes these images, the purpose of these images, as they're there to provoke an uncomfortable feelings of fear, despair, and an unsettling realization of complicity. And he goes on further to argue that they're there to show that the systemic nature of inequality, and a type of inequality that it's not necessarily organic, but it's there, it's rather planned or intentional. And I mean, you look at where this inequality, where these pictures are from, looks like most of them are from developing countries. But if you lived in the United States, you notice that this type of neighborhood differences are blatant. I mean, I actually, when I was navigating this website, I noticed that two of the images were from Brazil, where I was born and grew up. And both of these images, this place is almost 30 minutes away from my house. And this place also, it's in a different city where we used to have a beach house. And honestly, my house, it's about not even 15 minutes away from it. And perhaps what is most shocking is that growing up in Brazil, you are aware of these inequalities, but you still don't notice them until you take this aerial perspective. So what do these, why am I showing you these pictures? What do these pictures have in common? Well, very clearly, they show a divide between affluent neighborhoods and disadvantaged neighborhoods. And if we are to isolate at least some variables that are very different between these two neighborhoods, is the presence of greenery, not just the presence of just the fact that some images have green, but just how the lawns are maintained and how the greenery is maintained. The presence of disorder, and just the deterioration, the level of deterioration between these two types of neighborhoods. And I mean, perhaps obvious now that I showed you the photographs, these are all real images. They are not doctored images. They are taken via a drone. And the fact that these disparities are not really happening just in developing countries, but again, like I mentioned, in countries that we all grew up in and live in and work in. So there is a tremendous amount of research on neighborhoods and health. And I mean, the clearest message we get from it is that neighborhoods are a really strong predictor of health. And it has been a neighborhood disadvantage has been associated with things such as depression, anxiety, heart disease, obesity, antisocial behavior, and even mortality. So there's nothing new in this. There's people have been developing these neighborhood models in terms of health prediction for ages. But one thing that struck us as we were developing this project is that being able to draw causal inferences on the effect of the neighborhood on health is something that is incredibly difficult. So most of these studies are longitudinal in nature, and I mean, they are amazing studies, but really difficult to implement and sustain. But perhaps more problematic is this issue of a lack of control or the inability to control for exposure. And what these previous studies really have struggled with is being able to assess a relationship between neighborhoods and health, and health, but whether acute exposure leads to almost real-time differences in what we're later going to see as stress, in stress, emotion, and cognition. So this project started with actually my colleague, my office colleague, Dan Heckman, when I was at Penn, who really this type of research is his focus. And since I was doing a lot of VR work, we said, well, this is a good idea for us to work together. But when we started, all we wanted to really do was to kind of develop and validate, I guess, a model using VR that would allow us to examine these causal influences of differences in neighborhood on emotion, behavior, and physiology. And while we were at it, we said, well, let's try to tackle one of the more difficult hypotheses that have been posited, is whether socioeconomic status is actually moderating changes in stress reactivity depending on the neighborhood. And we were very careful on addressing this question and isolating perhaps two possible mechanisms, either a process of habituation where there will be some form of down regulation after repeated exposure, or a process of what we characterize as sensitization, where prolonged exposure with these in these neighborhoods would lead to an increased physiological reactivity. So we set out on kind of an absurd task to create two virtual cities, I guess our own GTAs, that would vastly differ in affluence or disadvantage. And we did this really systematically. What we did is that we based the differences on these neighborhoods based on real neighborhoods, mainly in the United States, but some German cities as well. And we used these photographs in order to pick out the items that we knew that would differ between these neighborhoods. I should say that we worked a little bit backwards using Odger's, what's it called again? The SSO, Systematic Social Observation Questionnaire, where it basically kind of lists different components of a neighborhood. And we were there essentially looking at the two ends of the spectrum. We wanted to make these neighborhoods very different from each other, but we didn't want to also create a disadvantaged neighborhood that looked like a war zone. So we were trying to stick to things that were try to stay as realistic as possible. And we went all out on this. So we played with just physical and social disorder, the presence of graffiti, the presence of garbage, the presence of greenery. We then hired an artist to develop hundreds of signs that we used to strategically place in these neighborhoods. And we would have more affluent type of stores in the affluent neighborhood, like your yoga den, your coffee shops, your library, your organic grocer. And in the disadvantaged neighborhood, we would have your dollar store, your fast food chains, and so on. We also created 150 avatars based on the US census. So in terms of balancing in terms of gender and race. I should mention now that we kept these same avatars in both cities. So the same avatars in the navigating or populating the affluent neighborhood are also the ones in the disadvantaged neighborhood. And this leads to later on to some interesting results. So what I want to do here is just, let me see, hopefully this is going to work. I will play a small video. I have no idea how this plays back of what these cities look like. And what we did as a part of a task, we wanted to maximize exposure here. So we didn't want to give participants any really complex task as they were navigating the cities. All they were told was really that they were supposed to get into the city and walk into the city following these arrows that appear on the ground and try to collect these little gems that you see. They were not aware that there was going to be the types of questionnaires that were going to come after. They were told that they were just going to answer some questions regarding their experience in the city. Navigating the cities took about 30 to 35 minutes, so long time exposure. We didn't do this using immersive VR. This was a desktop VR setup, mainly because people could not handle this amount of time stuck with a head-mounted display. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about, very quickly, just to go over the participants and the methods. So we were able to recruit 68 participants. 50% of these participants were female. They were rather young. These were university students, but they had quite a bit of breadth in terms of the countries that they were coming from. One other point that I want to highlight here is parental education. And we noticed that 64% of the participants, at least one of their parents had attended university. And this is a really important point to highlight because, well, we conducted a study in Zurich, and Switzerland in general is pretty vanilla when it comes to social differences. So it was very, very hard to get a good measure that was going to inform us about differences in socioeconomic status. And from the beginning, we went on with this idea that probably parental education rather than income or anything like that was going to be our biggest indicator. And then we also worth mentioning is that this was not a comparative study. So participants did not navigate the affluent city and then navigate the disadvantaged city. They were really just assigned to one of the cities, so a between subjects design. Our basic procedure was that they came in, we fitted them in with the physiological equipment, and then we just gave them some basic questionnaires, pretty long social demographic questionnaire, because we wanted to figure out what would be the best measure to get into this SES, to create this proper SES profiles, recent activities, and then a video game questionnaire. We then let them just calm down, and they just stared at us at a cross for a couple of minutes. And then we trained them really hard on the joystick. So we first showed them the controls of the joystick, and then we put them in a maze environment where I think they navigated the maze for about 7 to 9 minutes, where they were just walking around this maze, and their goal was just to really collect these gems, in a way practicing to what they were going to later do in the city. Once they finished the maze, they could pretty much handle the joystick, and we specifically forced them to kind of not only just walk back and forward, but like look up and down and use the wrist to turn the joystick. These things are important because we wanted them to search for these gems in the city in order to kind of look around as much as they would, as much as they could while navigating. We then put them through to watch a nature video for about 6 minutes. This was our physiological baseline. And then finally, they went ahead and they navigated the city, took about 35 minutes. And then they went down to a recovery phase of about 3 minutes. And then we put them through another battery of questionnaires. And really important questionnaires here were an emotions questionnaire where they just rated how they felt while navigating the city. And then the systematic social observation, which is a pretty massive questionnaire that goes through every characteristic of a neighborhood. And you essentially have to rank how much of it was present or absent. And then finally, they finished. And this took about 1 hour and 45 minutes, so a pretty long procedure. This is why our sample size is good, but not awesome. This is our setup. That monitor looks smaller than it is. It's a 56-inch monitor. But more important, the physiological measures that we were collecting electrodermal activity using the 2 fingers in their non-dominant hand. And we were specifically looking at the number of non-specific skin conductance responses. So every time there was a spike above threshold, we recorded that. We also recording blood pressure. And this was a really clever mechanism, again, devised by the computer scientist Yasha Raphael, where we fitted the participant with a blood pressure cuff. And what we did is that this cuff would inflate every 3 minutes. So while they were navigating the city, we got at least 10 different blood pressure readings as they were going through it. And we also collected an ECG, specifically looking again at heart rate variability and the HF, so the high frequency band. If we have more time, we can discuss why we picked the high frequency band, but not super important now. So just very quickly, the results. These results are, I mean, they're very obvious in some ways, but they're very comforting, and they kind of set up to the more interesting, which is the physiological results. So what we found was that the type of neighborhood that the participant navigated really elicited very clear differences in the perception of neighborhood characteristics. So if you navigated the affluent neighborhood, you really, when you were conducting that systematic social observation, there were very clear differences between the people navigated that affluent neighborhood or the disadvantaged neighborhood in terms of physical disorder. And by physical disorder, I specifically mean signs of garbage, litter, graffiti, burned out cars, and so on. We also see that in terms of decay, very clear differences between the affluent and the disadvantaged neighborhood. Physical decay includes sidewalks, streets, residential streets with gardens, and so on, or gardens that are not really tended well. And then street safety. And street safety is actually one of my favorite variables in the study, because street safety, it was not necessarily how safe you felt, but rather the presence of traffic calming measures such as like speed bumps, street signs, bike lanes, crosswalks, and so forth. And one of my favorite things is that the only street calming measure we had in both cities was the presence of crosswalks. We never had bike lanes or speed humps or anything like that. And yet participants that navigated the affluent neighborhood, they were sure that they saw them. So these were the kind of things that we kind of really like to start seeing in there. Again, obvious results in terms of trees. Even though we had a well-balanced number of trees in both neighborhoods, the greenery was probably something that differentiated both of these two neighborhoods. In terms of how they felt, in terms of safety and danger, again, very clear differences between the affluent and the disadvantaged neighborhood. And then we asked them to appraise the socioeconomic status of the actual neighborhood. And again, very clear differences between the affluent and the disadvantaged. We had 2 manipulation checks in that we kept both the weather and the time of the day consistent. And we had asked those also as part of our questionnaire. And here, again, as we hoped for, we didn't see any differences in the weather or the time of the day. So what about emotional response? So here again, and again, I'll remind you that this is a between subjects design. So they are not comparing, they are just rating how they felt navigating this environment. And what we see again is that if you navigated the affluent city, you tended to feel more, to relate to more positive emotions. And the positive emotions that we were looking for were amusement, enthusiasm, and happiness. And if you navigated the disadvantaged city, you were lower in the positive emotions, but higher in the negative emotions. So anger, fear, sadness, and disgust, very strong effects, very clear effects. And then again, we see these really interesting results where if you navigated the disadvantaged neighborhood, while there were no differences in surprise between the disadvantaged and the affluent, there were differences in terms of compassion. So people that navigated the disadvantaged neighborhood felt more compassion towards the, I guess, avatars or the people populating the cities. So in terms of our behavior results, we were quite happy about the VR framework that we developed. But what about the physiological results? So one thing that became really apparent early on, and it was consistent for both for all of them, blood pressure, skin conductance, and heart rate, and the electrocardiogram was that we could not pick out any main effects. So there were no differences in reactivity between the disadvantaged neighborhood and the affluent neighborhood. There were very clear differences in reactivity if we compare that to our nature baseline, but we were expecting that to happen. However, what we did find, and it's perhaps the most interesting result of the project, was that we found that socioeconomic status actually moderated the effect of neighborhood affluence or disadvantage. So in other words, in terms of blood pressure and in terms of skin conductance, if you were coming from an affluent background, so high socioeconomic status background, you tended to react much stronger to the affluent neighborhood and lower to the disadvantaged neighborhood, and vice versa. If you're coming from a disadvantaged neighborhood, from a disadvantaged background from low SES, you tended to react higher in the disadvantaged neighborhood and lower in the affluent neighborhood. And this fit very well with that hypothesis we put out in the beginning, this idea of sensitization. And it's kind of a really sad hypothesis if you think about it. It's almost reactivity being a reward, being rewarded for growing up in these neighborhoods. I mean, given the fact that we saw these very, very strong emotional responses, we know at least the valence associated with this arousal we're picking up in the blood pressure or the skin conductance. And it feels that while you are being rewarded for being in a affluent neighborhood, this environment is something that makes you feel good. It's a positive stress. When you are in the disadvantaged neighborhood, perhaps this is not working to your advantage. We're now exploring different ways, different things that we can do with these cities. I must say that this has been a major disappointment, really hard thing we're trying to do. We were very excited by the fact that we created everything in VR, so we could actually isolate how much greenery, how many pixels were green, how many pixels were avatar, how many pixels were just deterioration. And because we had this continuous measure in skin conductance, we thought that we would be able to then replay these videos and then find a correlation between the presence, or find a model that would allow us to further investigate the presence of these of avatars, deterioration, or just the built environment in general, or nature. And I'm sorry, I mean, surprisingly, we could not find anything. There was a weak effect with the presence of avatars, which my colleague Dan Heckman is exploring now in a more controlled experiment. But in terms of greenery or anything like that, we actually could not find much. All right, so I'm going to change gears, and then I think what I'm trying to do is finishing time so we can have time for a good discussion. So the other experiment I want to talk about is wayfinding and motivation. And really, this experiment kind of grew up out of the fact that we were so invested in creating this city for this previous neighborhood experiment. We were navigating the city, trying to understand what we wanted to do. We thought that it would be a good idea to actually look at whether being under pressure would facilitate or hinder wayfinding performance. And we're definitely not the first people to do this. There's a fantastic paper by Thackeray Brown that came out in Current Biology a couple of years ago, where he really clearly shows that there's a very strong effect of stress in the sense that stress really messes up your wayfinding ability. It completely affects the regulation of your hippocampus while you're navigating, or the ability, the fact that Thackeray Brown, that perhaps the most interesting effect is that people under stress were not shortcutting, they're shortcutting much less than the people that were not were not put under stress. So we were kind of interested in this same question. And really, when we started looking at the literature, this is pre-Thackeray Brown, which I mean, and the reason I keep calling his paper because I found that he did this really elegantly. These are very strong and clear results. But when we were reading the literature at this time, we found that it was kind of still an open question. There were some others, there was some research that's shown that stress can affect or impairs wayfinding performance. There was other research that showed that actually stress enhances wayfinding performance. And then there was a couple of articles we found that, well, it actually makes no difference. So we found a nice we had a good model to collect physiological data. We said, well, we have the city, we have a good methodology to collect, we might as well try something here. And I mean, one of the arguments that when we were putting this forward, we were thinking, well, I mean, perhaps this disparity in results is related to the type of VR that they were using. A lot of the times, the VR was very, very simplistic. A lot of the times, I would not even consider it to be a navigation task. It's more of a spatial task. A lot of these studies did not have a real-time physiological component. The way that people were getting stressed was pretty much detached from the actual task. So either putting their hands in cold water or the Trier social stress test. So things that would stress you, but not really analogous to the test. And then one of the things we noticed is that also none of these experiments had really looked into gender differences in spatial ability or just spatial ability, individual differences in spatial ability. Things that we know from spatial cognition literature that can potentially be one of the reasons why there's so many discrepant results. So simple question in this experiment. We really just wanted to see whether a person's physiological state affects their ability to wayfind. And we came in with this hypothesis that, well, I guess this research question, will navigating under pressure lead to better performance, which we're going to call it engagement, or will it interfere with their actual wayfinding? And are there gender differences when wayfinding under pressure? So city looks familiar. This is, I guess, 1/4 of one of the neighborhoods. So this just gives you the scale of the previous virtual environments that we created. We recruited 60 people for this experiment. 29 of them were females. And we assigned them to either what we're calling the control condition, and I'm calling them motivation, and I'll get to that in a second. But two conditions, again, simple between subject design, control versus motivation. Independent of your group, control, motivation, everybody went through this learning phase where they were dropped into the city and they had a shopping list of 4 locations that they had to find. And to help them find, again, pretty complex environment, to help them find these 4 locations, we also gave them the ability to consult a map. And this was very similar to something you would do if you're navigating using Google Maps. You would see your position, where you are in the environment, and the position of the 4 locations, and your position would update. And participants, they had about 16 minutes to explore the city, locate these 4 locations, no specific order, but they were specifically instructed to try to remember the position of these 4 locations because they would need to retrieve it in a later testing phase. In the testing phase, that's where we separated between the control and motivation. The control condition, basically, they had no map. They had 16 minutes to find these 4 locations in a specific order this time. But what we did is that we included a timer. And at first, we had no timer, and we were debating what was happening. And we were unhappy with what was happening during pilot. We just found that if we didn't give any form of push to people just took really long to navigate the cities, and the experiment went on forever. So what we did is that we gave them I wouldn't call it time pressure, because this was almost 3 standard deviations above what it would normally take to find these locations. But they were told that they had about 60 minutes to find these destinations. And again, they could not consult a map, so they had to retrieve the locations and navigate to these locations based on memory. In the testing, in the motivation group, what we did is that we kept the time pressure, again, these 60 minutes, but in order to put an additional pressure there, what we did is that we started taking money away from them. And this was not fictional money. This was actually money that they were told that they would get paid at the end of the experiment. And this was decreasing at a pretty fast rate. So it was decreasing at approximately 2 cents per second. So you had there your timer ticking down, but you're also pretty aware that if you did not find these locations fast enough, you're going to get $0 by the 0 francs by the time you finish the experiment. So we found this to be a fantastic motivator and really tied into actually the tasks that they were performing. So again, just to give you a sense of what it looked in the learning phase. So this participant is trying to get to the bar. It's a bit fast forward, but you're going to see he calls the map a couple of times, looks at the map, adjusts where this person needs to go, and then eventually is going to locate the map. And we kept track of the map calls. So every time they press the trigger button to get to the location, and we also kept track of how long did they actually inspect these maps. In the testing condition, you can see here, we have again, the clock is ticking and you have the reward ticking going down with the clock. Again, they were very specifically instructed to go to the location that is on the screen. So they could not just randomly retrieve any location they wanted. So if they by chance passed by a location and it was not the one they had to go to, they had to go back and figure out how to get to the other location. So again, our procedure came in, we attached the sensors. Here we gave a demographics questionnaire. We also gave the SBSOD, tried to tease out some of these individual differences. Trained again the joystick. We gave them the maze environment. This time we used the maze environment as our baseline. We wanted to really get out any stress or that was related to kind of manipulating the joystick. And then we put them through 3 blocks of learning and then testing, and then learning and testing, and learning and testing. And then at the end, we also gave them the simulator sickness questionnaire as a final questionnaire. So quickly go through the results. And I should say that for all the results I'm going to present here, we use this exact same model. So we used a 2x2, very simple model, 2x2 ANOVA. So condition, control versus motivation versus the other 2, which was male and female, just a gender. We did not find this in the first graph I'm showing you here is just our manipulation check. We wanted just to find out, were participants in the testing phase when the money was counting down, were they getting motivated or stressed? Was it affecting their heart rate? We could not pick up anything in skin conductance, but we did find a main effect of conditions. So participants in the motivation condition, they showed higher heart rate, and we also found a gender effect. Males in general also had elevated heart rates compared to females. One thing I want to point out here is, notice that I'm giving you the spread, and this is important because all graphs are kind of the same way. Large individual differences, not only heart rate, in terms of navigation time, in terms of SPSOD, sense of direction, and so on. So all the statistics we conducted here are robust stats. So we're looking at the median. We're actually comparing medians. So 2x2 ANOVA, but we're looking at differences in the medians. So what about sense of direction? Sense of direction, again, similar model. We show very clear individual differences in terms of females rating themselves, so subjective sense of direction, rating themselves as being worse, having a lower sense of direction compared to males. We were happy to find that there were no differences or no main effects or interaction in terms of simulator sickness. So didn't matter what group you're in or what condition, simulator sickness. Although there are some people, some females that were pretty high. Looking at the medians, again, it's a median test. There were no differences there. We also looked at the map checks. So how many people during the learning phase, how many times did they press this check? Again, no differences here, no main effects, no interactions. Females seem to check the map a bit more than men, but again, these differences are not significant. However, we did find a pretty large gender difference in terms of the amount of time spent inspecting the map. So females took much longer than men. In fact, they took, I think we calculated this before, it's 20–30% longer than men to actually complete what we're going to find out, complete the learning phase. They spent a long time looking at this map. We had two performance measures, the time that it took to learn the environment and the time that it took to retrieve the locations in the testing phase, or the distance walked. As you can see, as expected, these two performance measures are highly correlated, but we prefer to talk about the results in terms of time, mainly because time allows us to also take into consideration hesitations. This is something that you cannot do if you're looking at distance. So if you were there standing still, looking at a map, or standing still in the testing phase, thinking of where the locations are, you have the opportunity to look into these differences by looking at time. So what did we find? What is the main finding? So what we found, again, using the same 2x2 ANOVA, is that during the learning phase, as expected, since they were looking at the maps for so much longer, there was a large gender difference. Females took significantly longer than males to complete the learning phase. No interactions here, just a clear main effect. However, and I find that this is perhaps one of the most interesting results, when it came down to the testing phase, we found that these gender differences completely disappear. And in fact, the only thing that is significant, well, we have a main effect of condition, but the effect that trumps these all is that there's this very clear gender by condition interaction. So females in the control group, when their money was not being taken away, they took significantly longer time than men to retrieve these locations. However, in the motivation condition, when their money was going away, their performance really improved to almost match the performance of the male. So there are no differences here in interaction. And we went further we were interested in this idea of motivation, and we went a step further and looked at this correlation between change in heart rate and time during testing. And we can see this very clear correlation both for males and females. So participants that took less time to retrieve these 6 locations during the testing phase also had higher heart rate. So the last thing I want to talk about is this fire evacuation or emergency evacuation in VR. And this project really came out of a discussion in class with a couple of my students who were interested in the topic, and they were really motivated, and we took them in and we conducted the study in the lab. So majority of fires happen in built structures. I mean, the statistics, if you look at fires and deaths in Europe, are quite staggering. Perhaps more shocking in all the statistics is that a lot of the deaths in built structures have been related to signs that are non-adaptive. So basically signs that once the fire is under the sign, they don't help you navigate to the correct location. And I mean, we were quite shocked when we found out about this. And I mean, there's 2 specific studies, one in Düsseldorf and one in King's Cross, where they really linked deaths to non-adaptive signs. And perhaps more frustrating, I guess, in all of this is that the technology to use adaptive signs already exists. And if you kind of search around the internet, you're going to find tons of patents, tons of patents of people that put forward. There's quite a few agent-based studies, but we couldn't find any really solid behavioral studies on the topic. So let me explain what I mean by an adaptive versus a non-adaptive sign. A non-adaptive sign is the signs that we all know. So this is my old office at ETH, and it's a sign that should a fire occur, it's incapable of adapting to the emergency, and it's incapable of conveying any information that's going to help you avoid or navigate out of the building. In contrast, an adaptive sign is a sign that, well, I guess it's a smart sign that it will be able to, depending on the location of the emergency, be able to route you successfully out of the building. So again, simple research question. We wanted to find out if these signs, if adaptive signs can actually help you leave an emergency faster, safer, and hopefully calmer during a fire. So we had a variety of dependent variables, and they were strategically picked. So we were curious on the survival rate, the time to evacuate. This is really important because a lot of deaths in fire don't happen because of contact with fire, but with smoke. So we wanted to see how long it takes people to leave these buildings, how they were walking around these environments for the path length. Again, this health score is related to the time. Damage, fire damage is actually contact with fire, and whether they were calmer, whether navigating out of building with an adaptive sign will lead to more calmer evacuation. And we looked at this time looking at arousal, both again using an electrocardiogram and skin conductance, but also looking at subjective, how did they feel during the evacuation? And here we use the short stress state questionnaire. So for this experiment, we picked the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. We had 85 participants, again, simple conditions, non-adaptive sign condition or an adaptive sign condition. Love this virtual world because it was laser scanned. It's beautiful. In fact, I had a chance to visit this museum with Yasha a couple of years later, and one of the fun things about it is that you actually knew where everything was because we had been staring at this model for a really long time. So 3 floors in a building that is complex enough for this type of experiment. What we really loved about it is that if you're on the main floor, you can reach the second floor using one major stair, but you can also use these 2 side stairways. But the 2 side stairways would also go up to the 3rd floor, but not to the major staircase. So what this did is that it just opened up a variety of different fire scenarios that we could create and force them to use the adaptive signs in order to get out of the building. Again, very simple protocol. We put the equipment, they train with the joystick, answer a couple of questions, then they go through this learning phase of the museum, and then they have to evacuate the museum, and then we give a second questionnaire. Just to give you a sense of the learning phase, this is a typical learning phase where we had the participants kind of just following a route, collecting gems, and they would go, we try to make them canvas as much as possible of the museum. They'll go up to the 2nd floor, come up, investigate different rooms, and then go up to the 3rd floor. And they didn't know that this was going to happen. When they reach a specific point in the 3rd floor, or in this case, in the 3rd floor, the fire alarms would trigger, and they were told, okay, you need to evacuate the building as fast as possible. They were not told in which condition they were in. They were told that they had to evacuate. If they wanted to use the signs, they could. They just had to get out of the building. If you're in the non-adaptive condition, given the situation on the 3rd floor, you would come out here and you would get a decision point, and you would have to basically go by chance either to the left or to the right. If you went to the right in this scenario, it would be problematic because there was a fire in the 2nd floor here. But in the adaptive condition, the sign was already saying, hey, don't bother with this staircase, come out, take the side stairway, and keep following the signs. So I'll show you what this looked like. The alarm just triggered. The participant looks, you can see this one here is the adaptive sign saying don't go here. This participant is going to turn around very quickly while this participant is actually going to move forward in this decision. This one is now taking a different route. The fire is in the 2nd and the 1st and 2nd floor. This participant is going to get into trouble here. It's going to keep going down. Sign is still pointing to the exit, but this participant cannot exit this way. While this one is kind of moving around gonna kind of bypass the fire and get there. So what did we find? Well, we found very clear results in terms of behavioral results. So the percentage of people that successfully evacuated, they had about 5 minutes to evacuate, was higher for the adaptive sign. The time it took was shorter for the adaptive sign. The path, they actually walked, even though they had to do more circuitous paths, these people were just kind of disoriented and kind of going back and forth trying to find the exit. So they walked shorter paths. They exited the building with a higher health score. They suffered less fire damage. Unfortunately, however, we didn't find any significant differences in terms of NSER, heart rate, or heart rate variability between the two conditions. Again, we find very clear differences between fire evacuation and the baseline. I mean, fire is a stressful situation. So whether the sign was there, the adaptive or non-adaptive, it really didn't matter. But we did find quite an interesting subjective result, quite a strong effect also, using the short stress state questionnaire. Again, people that use the non-adaptive, they suffered way more distress compared to the adaptive group, and there were no differences in engagement, which we're happy to see given the previous experiment, and no differences again in terms of worry. I'm going to stop here because this kind of just illustrates what we took a step forward in this, and we actually said, okay, well, this works really well with participants. Can we actually devise this this system? Can we actually create something that if fires happen in the virtual world, it would trigger a system that would then an adaptive sign system that would then reorient these what turned out to be agents out of the building. And we created two solutions: a centralized solution and our blockchain solution, which was a decentralized solution. The centralized solution basically had a central entity that controlled all the adaptive signs, and the decentralized had the advantage of not having this central entity. It actually had, every sign was a smart sign. Every sign had a sensor. So failure in a sign, or if a sign gets compromised because of a fire, would not jeopardize the system. It would actually just say that close this node, and the entire other system would adapt routing the participants. And what we found is that in our system, it took less than 2 seconds to generate the signs whenever a random fire was put. Of course, the centralized performed better, but I mean, we're talking here in the order of seconds to evacuate. And eventually, we tested this with agents in the same museum. This time, we went a step further. We put hundreds of agents into the museum, and then we just randomly set out fires. And then once the fire was set, these agents were told to evacuate. These were not zombie agents. They were actually quite clever agents with some memory of the previous sign, and they were specifically looking at signs to get out of the building. And what we found, again, very clearly, is that with the adaptive signs, the agents, I think it was 94% of the agents evacuated, while with the non-adaptive signs, about 47% of the agents managed to get out. All right. Sorry about rushing here at the end, but I at least wanted to cover this experiment. But yeah, if there are any questions, I would love to talk about this.